Hi, welcome to Explorations in Economic History. This is Explorations in Economic History and Thought Socialism, and today we'll be talking about the labor theory of value. So I recently saw a show on BBC called Masters of Money, which looked at Marx, Keynes, and Hayek, and the episode on Marx was quite good, quite even-handed, but one interesting thing about it was that it never covered Marx's labor theory of value. And we'll talk today about why that's a problem. Because Marx's analysis of capitalism and his proposal for socialism are both rooted and justified by his labor theory of value. So, what was Marx's labor theory of value? Well, the labor theory of value says that all value comes from labor. Now, all labor is not exactly identical in the labor theory of value. It is adjusted for skilled labor versus unskilled labor, for example. But the labor theory of value says that value is not subjective and based on scarcity, supply and demand. It is based on labor. And pretty much the rest of Marx's economic analysis comes from this labor theory of value. It's rooted in this labor theory of value. However, there are some complications to this analysis. For example, some Marxists will say that labor theory of value is really about exchange in the market. However, we'll look at that and we'll see that in fact his proposal for socialism was also based on his labor theory of value. His exploitation theory, for example, was based on the labor theory of value, and that justified his socialism. But there's even more to it than that, and we'll look at some of that today and see why it's so important to understand Marx's labor theory of value and to understand what that implies about the possibility of socialism. So just one quick side note before we get going on the labor theory of value. Many libertarians see the labor theory of value as completely distinct and opposite from anything that libertarians argue for. However, it is worth noting that the labor theory of value is quite similar, actually, to this sort of Lockean justification for property rights, because unworked land is not seen as automatically private property. The justification for property rights is often in when you mix your labor with something, then it becomes more your own, because your labor is an extension of yourself. And this is actually quite similar to the labor theory of value, which says that only labor is of value because you're putting your own work into it. So labor is seen as the root of the value in both cases. Of course, this is where the similarity ends. Libertarians and Austrians, although they recognize the importance of worked as opposed to unworked land, would not agree that, therefore, the value of a good can be based entirely upon the labor put into it. And they will talk about the subjective value. This is what the marginal revolution was all about. Demand is important in order to know the subjective valuation that people place upon different goods in the economy. So Marx responded to the idea that someone could spend the same amount of labor time and produce something that nobody wants by defining socially useful labor. So Marx said that the labor time put into something that nobody wants doesn't count because it's not socially useful labor. And he went a bit further in order to explain the different levels of skill and the different amounts of technology that are used in order to produce a product by saying that the average level of technology and the average level of skill can be used to determine the socially necessary labor time. Putting this all together, we can see a definition. This is from the Marxist Internet Archive of Marx's labor theory of value. The definition says that the labor theory of value is the proposition that the value of a commodity is equal to the quantity of socially necessary labor time required for its production. Now, some people, when they hear of the labor theory of value, say, well, what about the value that capital gives to labor? And a really simplistic analysis of the labor theory of value, a simple critique, which is maybe too simplistic, might say, well, the labor theory of value doesn't take into account the fact that, a factory improves the productivity of labor. That's not exactly true, because the labor theory of value does admit that capital does improve the productivity of labor. However, it says that the capital itself was created by labor. Now, so Marx's exploitation theory is rooted in his labor theory of value, because workers don't receive the full value of their labor because capitalists earn surplus value or profit rather than only the replacement rate to pay for the costs of capital, which of course is allowed because the capital itself is based on previous labor put into it. And the labor theory of value was also necessary to show that market prices wouldn't be necessary for economic calculation because the true value of goods was based on the amount of labor used to produce first the capital and then the products using that capital with a further amount of labor. Now, of course, the same amount of labor might produce two very different products. You could have a very nice, fine wine or a very cheap wine that people won't pay very much for, and they might both be produced with the exact same amount of labor, just on different land. So this again brings us back to that question of land and the value of land. And here's a quote by von Bavrik, which essentially makes the same point about very fine wine and inferior wine and how they could be produced using the same amount of labor. So this also brings up the point that prices reflect economies of scale and automation, things that make it more cheap to produce a product. And so it's not only the land that something is made on or the amount of capital that, based on the amount of labor that went into that capital, that is important. It's also a matter of what people are willing to pay for things that take more time and things that take less time, and the fact that prices reflect this, which is not possible if you're using the average level of technology in order to determine the price. So, for example, you have a very fine wine that was very labor intensive, and then you might have a very cheap beer which was made using a factory and the economies of scale and automation in order to produce that. But should you use a price that reflects only the average level of technology and the average amount of socially necessary, socially useful labor? So a very cheap beer is only valued by people often because of its very cheap price. And then, of course, there are people who can only afford something much more cheap. And this is something that the market is able to handle and able to adjust the different amounts of the more expensive and the cheaper one. So how was a planned economy going to handle all of this? Maybe everyone is paid the same, but does everyone desire the same goods? And doesn't it make more sense for something that was made very cheaply to actually reflect the cheapness of its production? And if you use the average socially necessary amount of labor, would you actually be able to produce the right amount of different goods? It's not simply a matter of socially useful or socially useless. There's a whole infinite gradation between very useful, very desired products that people are willing to pay a lot of money for all of the labor time put into them to, down to that cheap beer that you're only willing to pay a very small amount for. There's so much complexity in between that the willingness to pay at all different price levels is able to reflect, and that a planned economy would struggle with. How could the planners know how much people valued all these different products without the aid of some kind of market pricing? So, should the labor theory of value set wages across the economy? So one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the expansion of production requires capital. However, Marx was aware of the replacement rate. But the relative amount of profit is also important and needs to be set by the market in order for anyone to know what needs to be produced and how much to produce it, and whether to pull people in from one industry into another in order to be able to expand production in that other industry. So the relative amount of profit, which is in excess of just a simple replacement rate, or is less than a simple replacement rate if that industry should, or that firm should contract, that's just as important as just having a replacement rate at all. And if profit is appropriated by the state and wages are set by the state and prices are set, well, even if prices are not individually all set, even if only the capital goods have their prices set by the market, the other prices, the consumer goods prices, the retail prices, will reflect all of those decisions that were made by the state. So, and also profit is not only due to capital and to land, but also to the entrepreneurship, the human capital that goes into creating things. So there is actually plenty of evidence that this was something that Soviet planners had to discover when they attempted to plan prices and to plan investment and to have control over the wages and everything set by the labor theory of value. They found that even when they gathered all the data that they possibly could from the center, and they were drowning in oceans of data, their data was still not good enough. It wasn't of the right kind. It couldn't tell them whether to expand or contract certain industries, whether to make something at all. So if planners use the labor theory of value to set wages and prices, they won't reflect supply and demand, and the planners will be left groping in the dark, like a headless chicken. So, keeping in mind labor theory of value, we can move forward and ask how this looked when Lenin implemented it. Lenin laid out the basic groundwork and vision, but he didn't indicate how everything would possibly be put into practice, because he said economic laws as we know them would cease to exist, and so nobody could possibly tell you what the socialist society and the communist society would look like. So that's why it's important to see how Lenin interpreted Marx and how Lenin implemented Marx's ideas. If Lenin wanted to do it, he would have to sort out the practical details.